Evening, I'm gonna need y'all to wrap it up and head out. We got a complaint.
Officer, we just sat down, paid for our meals. What's the issue?
Doesn't matter, sir. They called it in as a disturbance. We don't watch someone.
On the night of September 4, 2021, at approximately 9:12 in the evening, a police officer entered a family-owned restaurant on the outskirts of Killeen, Texas, walked past every other occupied table in the building, and stopped directly in front of a black family of 4 who were midway through their dinner. Within 2 minutes, he had demanded they leave. Within 5, he had called for backup. Within 10, he had placed his hand on the father. What Officer Blake Thompson did not know, what no one inside that restaurant knew, was that the man sitting calmly across from him, the one refusing to stand without a valid reason, the one whose composure only seemed to aggravate the situation further, held a rank that commanded thousands of soldiers. He was a United States Army general. And every second of what happened next was being recorded. Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from, and tell us, had you been in that restaurant that night, what would you have done? Let's get into it. Officer Blake Thompson was 31 years old and had served with the Killeen Police Department for 6 years. His personnel file was unremarkable by most standards, satisfactory evaluations, no major disciplinary action, a handful of community interaction reports filed and forgotten. But inside the department, among the officers who had worked alongside him long enough to notice patterns, there was a quiet and shared understanding about how Thompson operated. He moved through confrontations with a speed that outpaced the situation. He read resistance where there was none and authority where he had none. Complaints had been filed, about his tone, about the conclusions he reached before he had finished listening, but none of them had traveled far enough to matter. On paper, he was simply a patrol officer working a Tuesday evening shift. The man he approached that night was 44 years old and had spent the better part of 2 decades inside a world Thompson had never entered. He had trained in conditions designed to strip away comfort, certainty, and composure, and had come out of each one with all 3 intact. He had led men through decisions that could not be undone, had learned to think clearly when everything around him was designed to make clear thinking impossible. That evening, none of that was visible in any conventional sense. He was a father. His wife sat beside him. His 2 children were across the table, still working through their meals, unaware that the evening was about to fracture. His name was General Marcus D. Ellington. And nothing about the way Officer Blake Thompson entered that restaurant suggested Thompson had any idea who was sitting in front of him. The sound that cut through the restaurant first was not a voice. It was the drag of a chair, the sharp, involuntary scrape of wood across the tile as the table closest to the entrance shifted slightly when Officer Blake Thompson moved past it without acknowledgement, his stride deliberate and already pointed in a direction he had chosen before he fully crossed the threshold. The restaurant was modest and mid-evening quiet. The kind of place where the lighting leaned warm and the kitchen sounds were familiar enough to be comforting, the low press of conversation, the soft percussion of utensils, a television mounted near the back corner running at low volume. It was not the kind of place where anything dramatic was supposed to happen. That was, in part, what made what followed so jarring to everyone present. Thompson did not scan the room when he entered. He moved through it. Past a two-top near the door where an older couple sat over coffee. Past a family of 3 near the window, the youngest drawing on a paper placemat. Past the counter where a waitress stood sorting receipts. He moved as though the destination had already been decided, and it had, because he stopped at a corner table occupied by a black family of 4, midway through their meal, none of them looking in his direction until his shadow crossed the table. The father looked up first. He did not flinch. He did not straighten with alarm. His gaze moved from the officer to the badge and back again with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing what was in front of them before deciding how to respond. His posture, which had been relaxed a moment before, did not tighten noticeably, it simply steadied. His wife registered the shift a second later and set down her fork without drawing attention to the motion. The children continued eating for another moment before the stillness of their parents reached them. Thompson's voice entered the room without introduction. He claimed there had been complaints. The word complaints landed in the air without weight, no name attached to it, no seat number, no staff member stepping forward to confirm. The waitress who had seated the family 20 minutes earlier and checked on them twice since paused near the counter when she heard it. She did not speak. But her expression registered something the word complaints did not earn. At the table, General Ellington did not raise his voice. He asked a question, a reasonable one, the kind any person in any restaurant had the right to ask when an officer of the law appeared without explanation and demanded they leave. He wanted to understand the basis. He was not agitated. He was precise. That precision appeared to frustrate Thompson more than any raised voice would have. Thompson stepped closer, shrinking the space between himself and the table in a way that was neither incidental nor professionally necessary. It was a choice, the kind of physical adjustment that communicates hierarchy before a single word is spoken. He repeated the instruction to leave. He did not answer the question about the complaint. He restated the demand with more force and slightly less language, as though the problem was volume rather than clarity. The mother did not plead. She did not escalate. She placed one hand near the edge of the table, not reaching for anything, not gesturing toward the officer, simply grounding herself in the moment, her attention divided between the men standing over her family and the two children whose eyes were beginning to move between their plates and the uniform. She said something quiet to the younger of the two without turning her head fully. The child settled, though not entirely. Around them, the restaurant was doing what rooms do when something wrong begins to happen in a public space. It contracted. The conversations at nearby tables did not stop at once. They thinned. Syllables trailed off mid-sentence. A fork was set down. A glass was held rather than sipped. Eyes moved toward the corner table and then away and then back, caught between the instinct to watch and the discomfort of watching. The reasoning Thompson offered shifted each time General Ellington quietly pressed for specificity. First it was complaints. Then it was comfort, other customers were uncomfortable. Then it was an order, a lawful order, offered without the legal framework that would make it one. The goalposts did not move because the situation was developing. They moved because there was no fixed ground beneath them to begin with. The restaurant staff moved in quiet, uncertain orbits around the situation. A line cook had appeared in the kitchen doorway briefly, taken in the scene, and retreated. The manager, a woman in her 50s who had owned the restaurant for 11 years and knew, with the certainty of someone who had run a business long enough to understand her own floor, that this family had not disturbed a single thing, stood near the register and said nothing. Not out of agreement. Out of the particular paralysis that descends when the person causing the disruption is wearing a uniform. The waitress who had served the family remembered, later, that the father had thanked her when she brought the children's meals. That he had asked whether the kitchen could accommodate a modification for his younger child. That the table had been, by every observable measure, exactly what it appeared to be, a family having dinner. She said nothing either. Thompson's tone sharpened as the seconds accumulated. He used the word removed. He used it the way people use words they want to land as warnings, slowly, clearly, with enough pause after to let the image settle. The father did not react to the image. He continued to ask, with diminishing patience but unbroken composure, what legitimate authority the instruction rested on. He was not performing resistance. He was applying it, the way someone applies pressure to something that requires pressure to be applied to. At the surrounding tables, phones had begun to appear. Not all at once. One near the window, angled low. Another at a two-top closer to the door. The recordings were not theatrical. They were quiet acts of documentation from people who understood, even before the situation had fully resolved itself into something definable, that what they were witnessing should not disappear. Thompson noticed the phones. He did not adjust. If anything, his voice rose slightly, as though the audience confirmed rather than cautioned him, as though visibility was indistinguishable from authority. He reached for his radio. The sound of the call going out, backup requested, non-compliant subject, moved through the room like a signal flare. The children understood it before they understood it. The younger one reached for the mother's arm. The older one went very still in the particular way children go still when they have realized the adults around them are no longer in control of what happens next. General Ellington stood. He did not stand quickly. He did not stand the way a man stands when he is preparing to argue or retreat or comply. He stood the way a man stands when he has made a decision, weight distributed, shoulders square, the motion unhurried in a way that conveyed not submission but something more unsettling to Thompson, the complete absence of fear. Thompson had expected the standing to resolve something. It did not. It reframed everything. Outside, the first set of sirens had begun, distant still, but closing. Inside, the diner held its breath. Thompson's hand moved toward the cuffs at his belt. He had the bearing of someone who believed the situation was still containable, still his to close. He had not yet looked carefully enough at the men in front of him. As General Ellington reached for his jacket, not to leave, not in compliance, but in the measured motion of someone preparing for what came next, the lapel shifted slightly. Just enough. A glimpse of something beneath, the edge of a credential, the corner of an insignia, the kind of identification that does not belong to private citizens. Thompson saw it. He did not recognize what it meant. He reached for the father's arm anyway. And that was the moment the night stopped being something that could be walked back. The backup officers entered the way backup always enters a scene that has already gone wrong, fast, reading the room from the doorway before their feet had fully crossed the threshold, trying to reconstruct the architecture of a situation they had no part in building. There were two of them. They moved toward the corner table, and for a brief moment the restaurant, which had contracted steadily over the past several minutes, seemed to contract again, the remaining patrons pressing almost imperceptibly toward the walls, phones still raised, breath held in the particular way people hold breath when they're watching something they cannot stop. General Marcus D. Ellington did not resist. That was the detail that registered across the room before anything else, the absence of struggle, the presence of something more difficult to name. He stood with his hands positioned deliberately where they could be seen, his posture unchanged from the moment he had risen from the table, and he allowed the contact with the same controlled stillness a man allows an inconvenience he has already decided is temporary. The restraint was not compliance. It was something older and more disciplined than that. The children were moved toward the entrance. The younger one reached backward once, instinctively, before being guided gently forward by the mother. The older one walked without being prompted, eyes forward, the kind of stillness in a child that is not peace but the careful management of something too large to process in public. They did not cry. That absence of tears was, in its own way, the most difficult thing in the room to witness. The mother moved alongside them, her attention divided with the precision of someone trained in maintaining composure across multiple demands simultaneously. She watched the officer. She watched her children. She watched the door. Her expression communicated nothing to the room that she had not chosen to communicate, which was, itself, a form of discipline that Thompson had never once considered might be present in the person he had chosen to remove. Thompson continued to speak to the arriving officers, reconstructing the evening in the language of official procedure, non-compliant, disturbance, refusal to follow lawful instruction. The words were technically formed. They simply did not match the room they were spoken inside. The waitress who had served the family had moved closer to the manager now, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and something passed between them in the silence that required no words. It was the senior officer among the backup, a man who had spent 17 years working a city that sat adjacent to one of the largest military installations in the country, who stopped. Not dramatically. He simply stopped moving and looked at General Ellington with the particular attention of someone whose professional experience had taught him what to notice. The posture. The deliberateness of every motion. The way the general's eyes moved through the room, not anxiously, not searching for exits, but cataloging. Assessing. The way men assess who have spent careers in rooms where accurate assessment determined outcomes. The senior officer asked to see identification. What he was handed did not require interpretation. It stated, clearly and without ambiguity, exactly who was standing in the corner of that restaurant in a pair of civilian clothes with another officer's hand on his arm. The senior officer read it once. Then he read it again. The shift that moved through him was small in its physical expression and large in everything else. His shoulders adjusted. His chin lifted slightly. The professional mask that law enforcement wears in active situations, neutral, procedural, non-reactive, slipped just enough to reveal the calculation happening underneath it. He turned toward Thompson, and the look he carried was not anger, not yet. It was the expression of someone doing rapid arithmetic on consequences. Thompson did not immediately accept what the identification represented. He reached for the framework he had built over the previous 20 minutes, the complaint, the disturbance, the refusal, the escalation, and held onto it, because the alternative was to let go of the entire structure at once, and that was not something a person does quickly when they have built it in public. He insisted the identification did not change what had already occurred. He used the word procedure. He used it more than once. The witnesses had begun to speak. Not all of them, and not loudly, but with the accumulated weight of multiple accounts pointing in the same direction. The waitress described the family's arrival. The patron near the window confirmed no disturbance had been visible before the officer entered. The manager, who had been silent through the confrontation itself, found her voice now and used it precisely, speaking to the backup officers directly, without theatrical emphasis, simply accounting for what she had observed from the moment the family had been seated to the moment Thompson had appeared. Here is a question this room left unanswered, and one only you can answer. Would you have spoken up in that moment, or stayed silent? Type "speak" or "silent" in the comments. Your reason matters more than your answer. What the room did not yet know, what would only emerge in the days that followed, as the footage was reviewed and the documentation was assembled, was that the evening had not been entirely without structure. General Ellington had been in Killeen as part of an informal review initiative, connected to a broader military community relations program examining civilian law enforcement interactions in towns adjacent to major bases. The dinner had been chosen without ceremony, a local restaurant, a weeknight, nothing to distinguish it from any other meal in any other city. The point had been the ordinariness of it. The point had been to observe, quietly, how a family moved through a public space in a community shaped by the military's presence. What it became instead was a different kind of data. 3 recording devices beyond the bystanders' phones had captured the encounter. 2 belonged to the restaurant's own security system, cameras positioned at the entrance and above the register, angled in ways that covered the corner table completely. 1 belonged to General Ellington himself, a compact device that had been running from the moment the officer's shadow had crossed the table, activated by the practiced instinct of a man whose professional life had taught him that documentation was not paranoia, it was preparation. The footage was not dramatic in the way that footage is sometimes made dramatic in its aftermath, slowed, scored, cropped for impact. It was simply complete. It showed everything that had occurred in the sequence in which it had occurred, and it required no narration to communicate what it meant. When the senior officer ordered the release, it happened without announcement. The contact was removed. The general adjusted his jacket with the same unhurried motion he had used throughout the evening, and he straightened to his full height, and for the first time since Thompson had approached the table, the dynamic in the room reorganized itself around the correct axis. Thompson stood in the geometry of that reorganization and did not appear to fully understand what had shifted, only that something had, and that the authority he had carried into the restaurant 40 minutes earlier was no longer in the same place he had left it. The family left through the front door in the order they had arrived, the children first, the mother beside them, the general last, pausing once at the entrance in the way a person pauses when they are committing a moment to memory rather than leaving it behind. The diner watched them go. No one spoke immediately. The silence that followed was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of a room still processing the distance between what it had witnessed and what it had been able to do about it. The footage moved quickly once it moved. By the following morning it had reached local news desks. By the evening it had traveled further. The story it told was not complicated: a family at dinner, an officer without cause, a rank that should have been irrelevant and was instead the only thing that produced accountability in the moment. That gap was what people responded to. That gap was the story. The diner staff submitted formal statements within 48 hours. The manager's account was detailed and consistent. The waitress described the family's conduct from arrival to removal with the kind of specificity that only comes from genuine recollection. The kitchen worker who had appeared briefly in the doorway came forward to add his own account. Each statement, individually unremarkable, collectively formed a structure that left no room for the narrative Thompson had constructed inside that restaurant. The internal investigation did not take long. The findings were consistent across the body camera footage, the restaurant security recordings, and the independent device footage, a convergence of documentation that left the department with a narrow set of options and an even narrower window in which to exercise them. Thompson was terminated. The announcement was procedural in its language and unambiguous in its implication. The civil process that followed moved with the deliberateness of something no one on the city's side had the leverage to slow. The settlement reached $3.8 million. The city did not formally admit to the specific conduct alleged. The number communicated what the language did not. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant returned to its ordinary rhythms the way places return to themselves after something has passed through them, not unchanged, but functional. The lighting stayed warm. The kitchen sounds resumed their familiar percussion. The corner table filled again, as tables do, with people who ordered and ate and left without incident. But the staff moved around it with a particular awareness. The manager paused near it sometimes in the early part of the evening, before the room had filled, in the way a person pauses near something that has acquired weight. The waitress said it without looking at it directly. Small adjustments. The kind that accumulate into memory. The general did not return. He had no reason to, and he had never needed the room to hold his story for him. What he had carried into that restaurant, and out of it, was not altered by the settlement or the termination or the national conversation that assembled itself around the footage. He had walked in as a father having dinner with his family. He had walked out the same way. The rank had not saved him. His restraint had not been performed for an audience. The documentation had not been assembled for leverage. Each of those things had simply been true. And truth, in the end, had not required amplification to do what it does, which is to remain true regardless of who is trying to talk over it. Power is not always announced. Authority is not always legitimate. And the distance between those two facts is where accountability lives, not in the moment the cameras appear, but in the decisions made before anyone thought to look. The corner table sat empty for a moment longer than usual, long after the dinner crowd had settled. Outside, the city continued at its ordinary pace. Inside, the warm light fell across an untouched surface, and the room held, for just a breath longer, the memory of a man who had refused to be moved, not because of his rank, but because of his understanding of exactly what was right. If this story made you think, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And if you want more real stories told this way, share this one, and subscribe so you're here for the next.